You wake up in a world where a simple fever could steal your strength for days, and a bad cough might worry your whole family. There are no painkillers on the shelf, no neat white coats, no humming machines. Instead, there are careful hands, watchful eyes, and a deep belief that illness has meaning. That is the world of ancient medicine, and it feels both strange and strangely familiar. From the first cities along wide rivers to the bustling streets of Rome, healers did what they could with what they understood. They listened to the body like it was a riddle from the gods. They watched the sky, smelled herbs, felt pulses, and read clues on the skin. Some of their choices now seem wise, like washing with vinegar or using honey to help wounds heal. Others were born from fear or hope more than knowledge. But even the missteps left footprints on the road that leads to modern care. In Mesopotamia, people believed that sickness did not just live in the flesh, it touched the spirit. A healer might whisper a prayer at dawn, grind a plant at noon, and set a charm by night. Imagine a clay tablet listing signs to watch for and remedies to try. It might suggest honey for a raw throat, or a ritual to calm whatever unseen thing was troubling the patient. There were also brave attempts at surgery. With bronze tools, a steady hand might clear a clouded eye. It was careful work, learned by doing, passed from teacher to student like a guarded recipe. Along the Nile, the Egyptians opened the body in service to the dead and learned its paths and chambers. That knowledge guided those who cared for the living. Doctors wrote down hundreds of remedies: garlic for the heart, willow for aches, bread that had turned soft with growth pressed against a wound to chase away the heat of infection. They believed in channels that ran through us like rivers through the desert, and they aimed to keep those waters flowing. A healer could be a scholar and a priest at once, speaking to both the body and the divine. Then on bright islands and rocky coasts, Greek thinkers began to ask different questions. What if illness came from the world around us and the habits within us, rather than from spirits alone? They looked at air, food, sleep, and the balance of fluids they believed moved through the body. They advised simple diets, calm walks, clean surroundings, and careful observation. The idea was gentle. First, do no harm. Of course, they also clung to practices that did more harm than good, like drawing blood to restore balance. But the shift in spirit was real. Listen to nature. Learn from patterns. Trust reason. In Rome, medicine marched with the legions. On roads and in camps, practical minds refined tools and routines. They cleaned wounds with sour wine. They organized care for the injured so the worst cases were seen first. They experimented with splints and early versions of replacement limbs. Their greatest thinker, who learned from animals rather than people because human dissection was forbidden, left books that would guide doctors for more than 1,000 years. Some of his ideas were wrong, yet his method of careful study and comparison lit a long fuse that would burn through the ages. Through all of this, there were human moments that feel close to us even now. A mother cooling a child's forehead with a damp cloth. An apprentice trying to steady trembling fingers. A patient weighing fear against trust as a healer lifted a tool to help. Small victories must have felt like miracles. A wound that finally closed. A fever that broke at dawn. And there were losses that weighed heavily, teaching lessons written not with ink, but with memory. So how did our ancestors treat illness? With plants and prayers, with observation and experiment, with courage and mistakes. What theories did they believe? That unseen forces might trouble us, that the body seeks balance, that nature offers clues if we pay attention. Could you have survived their cures? Maybe. Many people did. Many did not. But every attempt, whether it soothed or failed, moved the story forward. If you love uncovering history's quiet triumphs and forgotten puzzles, come along with us. Tap that like button, share this with someone who loves a good origin story, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires, your doorway to the ancient world. And tell us in the comments, would you trust an ancient healer with your life? And if so, whose hands would you choose? Picture this. You're living in ancient Mesopotamia, somewhere between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. thousands of years before Christ walked the earth. You wake up with a fever, your head pounding, your body aching. But the healer you call for doesn't just ask about your symptoms. He wants to know if you've angered any gods lately, if you've walked past any suspicious shadows, if maybe a demon has taken residence inside your body. This was medicine in the world's first great civilization. The Mesopotamians genuinely believed that sickness came from two worlds at once. Yes, your body was suffering, but the root cause, that was supernatural. Invisible demons lurked everywhere, waiting to slip into an unsuspecting person and wreak havoc from within. So healing wasn't just about treating what you could see, it was about driving out what you couldn't. The healers of Mesopotamia were part doctor, part priest, part detective. They'd examine you carefully, noting every symptom, every complaint. And here's what's remarkable. They wrote it all down. Around 1700 years before Christ, these ancient physicians created something extraordinary called the Diagnostic Handbook. Imagine that. A medical textbook from nearly 4,000 years ago, listing symptoms and their treatments in careful detail. Some of their remedies were surprisingly practical. They used honey to dress wounds, and we now know that honey has genuine antiseptic properties. They understood that certain plants could ease pain or reduce inflammation. They knew which herbs could settle an upset stomach or help you sleep. This wasn't just guesswork. It was accumulated knowledge passed down through generations of healers. But then there were the other treatments, the ones that remind us just how differently they saw the world. If the healer determined that a demon was indeed responsible for your illness, the cure might involve elaborate rituals. Sometimes they'd sacrifice a goat, believing the demon would transfer into the animal and leave your body. Other times they'd chant prayers and incantations, calling on protective deities to intervene. The line between medicine and magic wasn't just blurred, it didn't really exist at all. Now, here's where it gets truly fascinating. These same people who believed in demonic possession were also performing surgeries that would make modern doctors pause in respect. Mesopotamian surgeons actually removed cataracts from people's eyes. Think about that for a moment. They took bronze needles, bronze, one of the first metals humans learned to work with, and they carefully operated on the delicate structures of the human eye. This was 3,600 years before modern ophthalmology even existed. They didn't have microscopes. They didn't have anesthesia. They certainly didn't have the germ theory of disease or any understanding of infection. Yet somehow they developed the skill and precision to restore sight to people who had lost it. The steadiness of hand required, the knowledge of anatomy, the sheer courage of both surgeon and patient. It's almost unimaginable. What drove them to attempt such procedures? Perhaps it was compassion for those living in darkness. Perhaps it was the same curiosity that drives scientists today. Or maybe it was simply necessity. When someone is suffering and begging for help, healers have always been willing to try. The Mesopotamian approach to medicine reveals something profound about human nature. Even when our explanations are wrong, even when we attribute illness to demons and spirits, we still observe carefully. We still experiment. We still share what works. These ancient healers were doing the best they could with the understanding they had. They mixed the rational with the mystical because, to them, both were equally real. Their legacy isn't just in the specific treatments they used or the surgeries they performed, it's in the very idea that symptoms could be categorized, that treatments could be recorded, that medical knowledge could be preserved and taught. The Diagnostic Handbook wasn't just a book, it was a declaration that healing was a skill that could be learned, improved upon, passed down. So yes, they believed demons caused disease. Yes, they sacrificed goats and chanted prayers, but they also dressed wounds, performed surgery, and built the first medical libraries. They were the beginning, flawed, mystical, but undeniably the beginning, of humanity's long journey toward understanding the body and defeating disease. Here's something that might seem strange at first. The Egyptians became brilliant doctors, partly because they were obsessed with death. Not in a morbid way, but in a deeply spiritual one. They believed so firmly in the afterlife that they spent enormous resources preserving bodies for the journey ahead. And in doing so, they learned secrets about the human body that no other civilization could match. Think about what mummification actually required. You had to open the body, remove the organs, understand what went where, know which parts needed special treatment. Generation after generation of embalmers worked with human anatomy in the most intimate way possible. They saw the heart, the lungs, the liver. They observed how these organs looked when someone died young versus old, from illness versus injury. They noticed patterns. They asked questions. And slowly, that knowledge began to flow from the embalmers to the physicians. The result was a medical tradition that genuinely understood the body in ways that seem almost modern. Egyptian doctors knew the heart pumped blood. They recognized that pulse rates mattered. They understood that channels carried substances throughout the body, even if they didn't quite grasp the full picture of circulation. This wasn't mystical guessing. This was observation, careful and repeated. But here's the beautiful contradiction at the heart of Egyptian medicine. These same doctors who could diagnose based on physical symptoms also believed in magic spells. They'd examine your tongue, check your pulse, ask about your pain, and then recite an incantation to protect you from evil spirits. Science and sorcery sat side by side, and to them, both were simply different tools in the healer's kit. Around 1550 years before Christ, someone in Egypt created one of the most remarkable documents in medical history. We call it the Ebers Papyrus, and it's essentially an ancient medical encyclopedia stretching over 20 meters long when unrolled. Imagine the time it took to write this, the knowledge it represented. More than 700 remedies, carefully recorded in hieratic script. And here's what's astonishing. Some of those remedies actually work. The papyrus recommends garlic for heart disease. Now, thousands of years later, modern research confirms that garlic can help lower blood pressure and cholesterol. The ancient Egyptians didn't know about cholesterol or blood pressure, of course, but they observed that people who ate garlic seemed to have fewer heart problems. They paid attention, and they remembered. They used honey for wounds, willow bark for pain, which contains the same active ingredient as aspirin. They prescribed castor oil as a laxative, a treatment still used today. They understood that certain herbs could bring down fevers, that others could help with digestion, that some plants could ease a woman's pain during childbirth. This was knowledge built on centuries of trial and error, of careful watching and recording. But perhaps the most incredible discovery was one they made without even realizing it. Egyptian doctors sometimes treated infections by applying moldy bread to wounds. Yes, bread that had gone bad, covered in fuzzy green growth. It sounds absurd, doesn't it? Like the kind of folk remedy you'd dismiss immediately, except it worked. Not always, but often enough that they kept doing it. And here's why. Certain molds produce penicillin, the antibiotic that would revolutionize medicine in the 20th century after Christ. The Egyptians had no concept of bacteria or antibiotics. They didn't know why moldy bread sometimes helped infected wounds heal. They just knew that it did, and so they used it. They were harnessing one of the most important medical discoveries in human history, completely by accident, thousands of years early. If you're finding these ancient breakthroughs as fascinating as we do, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What surprises you most about Egyptian medicine? And if you want to keep exploring these untold histories with us, consider liking this video and subscribing to Legacy of Empires. We're sharing stories from the ancient world that deserve to be remembered. Egyptian medicine wasn't perfect, of course. They had treatments that did nothing, theories that were wrong, practices that sometimes hurt more than helped. But what matters is that they tried, they observed, they experimented. They wrote down what worked and taught it to the next generation. They blended the mystical with the practical because both gave them comfort, and sometimes both seemed to bring results. There's something deeply human about the Egyptian approach to healing. They faced the same fears we do, pain, sickness, death, and they fought back with everything they had. Prayer and poultices, spells and surgery, magic and medicine. They refused to accept suffering passively. They believed healing was possible, And that belief drove them to keep searching, keep trying, keep learning. The next time you take an aspirin or use honey on a cut, remember, you're using remedies that Egyptian doctors would recognize. Across thousands of years, across completely different cultures and beliefs, that knowledge survived because it worked. Because someone in ancient Egypt paid attention, tried something new, and cared enough to write it down for the future. That's the real legacy of Egyptian medicine. Not just the specific treatments, but the commitment to healing, the willingness to learn from both success and failure, and the understanding that helping the sick requires both knowledge and compassion. Imagine being the person who stands up and says, "There are no demons. Sickness isn't punishment from the gods. Your fever isn't caused by an angry spirit or a curse from an enemy. It's just nature, following its own rules. And we can understand those rules if we look closely enough." This was Hippocrates, and in the 5th century before Christ, what he proposed was nothing short of revolutionary. For thousands of years, civilizations had explained illness through the supernatural. The Mesopotamians saw demons. The Egyptians invoked magic alongside their medicines. Even the Greeks themselves told stories of Apollo sending plagues, of vengeful gods striking people down with disease. And then came this physician from the island of Kos, who said, "No, stop looking to the heavens for explanations. Look at the patient. Look at what they ate, where they live, how they spend their days. Look at the air they breathe, the water they drink, the balance within their own bodies. The answers are here, in the natural world, not in some distant realm of spirits and deities." This shift in thinking is hard to overstate. Hippocrates wasn't just offering different treatments. He was offering a completely different way of understanding reality itself. He was saying that the human body operated according to principles we could observe, study, and eventually master. That illness had physical causes and physical cures. That medicine could be a science, not just an art mixed with prayer. He and his followers developed a theory that would dominate Western medicine for more than 2,000 years. They believed the body contained 4 essential fluids, which they called humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant these 4 humors remained in perfect balance. Illness meant something had tipped the scales. Too much blood made you feverish. Too much phlegm made you sluggish. The physician's job was to restore the balance. Now, we know this theory is wrong. We understand the body completely differently today, but here's what matters. It was a natural explanation. It was based on observation. People noticed that sick individuals often produced excess fluids, whether through vomiting, bleeding, or other means. The theory tried to make sense of these observations without invoking supernatural forces. That approach, that insistence on natural causes, was the real breakthrough. But Hippocrates gave medicine something even more profound than a theory. He gave it an ethical foundation. He taught that the physician's first duty wasn't to impress people with bold interventions or claim miraculous cures. It was simpler and deeper. First, do no harm. Think about what that means. It means admitting that sometimes the best thing a doctor can do is nothing, that healing takes time, that the body often knows how to repair itself if we just support it properly. That a physician's ego should never matter more than a patient's well-being. It means humility in the face of illness, honesty about what we know and don't know. This principle became the core of the Hippocratic Oath, a promise that physicians made, and still make today, more than 2,000 years later. Modern versions have changed the language, updated some concepts, but that central idea remains. The physician exists to help, never to harm. Your relationship with your doctor, the trust you place in them, the expectation that they'll put your welfare first. All of that traces back to a Greek physician on a small island who believed medicine needed moral guidelines as much as medical knowledge. Yet here's where the story takes a sobering turn, because being rational doesn't mean being right. The Greeks were wrong about the 4 humors, and some treatments based on that theory caused terrible harm. The most infamous was bloodletting, deliberately cutting open a vein to drain blood, believing this would restore balance and cure disease. In theory, it made sense within their framework. You have a fever? That's too much blood making you hot. Remove some blood and the balance returns. But in practice, bloodletting often made sick people weaker. It robbed them of the very strength they needed to fight illness. In many cases, it killed them. The tragedy is that this treatment persisted for centuries after Christ, long after ancient Greece had fallen. Physicians continued to believe in it, to teach it, to practice it. Even George Washington, the first president of the United States, died in 1799 in part because his doctors drained enormous amounts of blood trying to cure a throat infection. They meant well. They were following established medical wisdom. But they were wrong, and it cost him his life. This is the difficult truth about medical progress. Even the most brilliant minds, even the most dedicated healers can be mistaken. The Greeks were right to look for natural explanations. They were right to value observation and ethical practice. But they were human, and humans make errors. We see patterns that aren't really there. We hold on to theories because they feel true, even when evidence suggests otherwise. What saves us, eventually, is the very thing Hippocrates championed: the commitment to keep observing, keep questioning, keep learning. Medicine doesn't advance because we get everything right the first time. It advances because we notice when something isn't working, because we're willing to admit mistakes, because each generation builds on what came before while correcting the errors they find. Hippocrates freed medicine from the grip of superstition. He established that physicians should be guided by ethics as much as knowledge. He insisted that natural laws governed the body, and we could discover them through careful study. These contributions changed the world. They made modern medicine possible, but his story also reminds us to hold our certainties lightly, to remember that today's established wisdom might be tomorrow's discarded theory, to stay curious, stay humble, and never stop asking whether what we believe is actually true. That, perhaps, is the deepest lesson from the father of medicine. Not just what he got right, but his conviction that we should never stop trying to understand more. War has always been a terrible thing, but it taught the Romans something invaluable about medicine. Speed and practicality matter. When you have thousands of soldiers scattered across an empire that stretches from Britain to the deserts of North Africa, when battles can erupt anywhere and leave hundreds of wounded men bleeding on the ground, you don't have time for philosophical debates about the four humors. You need doctors who can work fast, think clearly, and save lives under the worst possible conditions. The Roman legions became mobile medical schools. Each legion had its own physicians, its own medical supplies, its own field hospitals called valetudinaria. These weren't just tents where wounded soldiers were left to die or recover on their own. They were organized facilities with multiple rooms, beds arranged in rows, supply storage, and operating areas. Archaeological excavations have uncovered the remains of these hospitals, and they look remarkably sophisticated. The Romans understood something crucial. If you wanted soldiers to keep fighting for the empire, you had to show them that the empire would take care of them when they fell. The military doctors developed a system that we still use today, though we call it by a French word now: triage. When wounded men flooded in after a battle, the physicians had to make quick decisions. Who needed immediate surgery? Who could wait? Who was beyond saving? It sounds cold, but it was actually deeply practical and compassionate. By focusing resources on those who could be saved, they maximized the number of lives preserved. This wasn't about giving up on anyone. It was about accepting the hard reality that one doctor couldn't save everyone simultaneously, so choices had to be made. They cleaned wounds with vinegar. Now, vinegar might sound like an odd choice, but it's actually mildly acidic and has antiseptic properties. The Romans didn't know about bacteria. That understanding wouldn't come for more than 1,500 years after Christ. But they observed that wounds cleaned with vinegar were less likely to become infected, less likely to develop that sickening smell and deadly fever that meant the wound had turned bad. So they used it, and they saved lives because of it. Roman surgeons carried instruments that would look surprisingly familiar to a modern doctor. They had scalpels, forceps, hooks, probes, and even surgical drills. Some of these tools have been found preserved in places like Pompeii, frozen in time when Vesuvius erupted in the year 79 after Christ. You can see the craftsmanship, the attention to detail, the understanding that a surgeon's instruments needed to be sharp, precise, and reliable. They even created prosthetic limbs for soldiers who had lost arms or legs in battle. These weren't just crude wooden replacements. Some were quite sophisticated, made from bronze and leather, designed to be functional rather than merely decorative. A soldier with a prosthetic leg could walk again, could maintain his dignity, could still contribute to society, even if he could no longer march with the legions. This represented a remarkable attitude, that disability didn't mean uselessness, that effort should be made to help the wounded return to as normal a life as possible. But if we're talking about Roman medicine, we can't avoid discussing the man who dominated it for centuries, Galen. Born in the year 129 after Christ in the city of Pergamon, he became the most influential physician in the Roman world, and his influence would extend far beyond Rome's fall. Galen was brilliant, ambitious, and absolutely convinced he was right about everything. He started his career as a physician to gladiators, which gave him extensive experience with traumatic injuries. He saw wounds that exposed muscles, bones, and organs. He learned what the body looked like inside in a way that most physicians never could. This experience made him confident, perhaps too confident, in his understanding of anatomy. The problem was that Roman society, like Greek society before it, considered dissecting human bodies deeply taboo. It was acceptable to cut open the dead on a battlefield when saving the living, but deliberately opening a human corpse for study? That was viewed as desecration, a violation of the person's dignity even in death. So Galen did what he could. He dissected animals, lots of animals. Pigs, dogs, monkeys, even elephants. He assumed that what he learned from them would apply directly to humans. Sometimes he was right. The basic structures are similar across mammals. Hearts pump blood, lungs bring in air, muscles contract to move bones. But sometimes he was wrong, and those errors would haunt medicine for more than 1,000 years. He described structures that existed in animals, but not in humans. He made assumptions about how blood flowed that weren't quite accurate. He was so confident, so authoritative, so comprehensive in his writings that later generations treated his word as absolute truth. Here's the complicated thing about Galen. He genuinely advanced medicine in many ways. He emphasized careful observation. He conducted experiments to understand how the body worked. He recognized the importance of the pulse in diagnosis. He documented hundreds of treatments and surgical procedures. His writings preserved enormous amounts of medical knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. But his dominance also held medicine back. For 1,500 years, physicians were trained to believe Galen was right about everything. Questioning him seemed like questioning truth itself. When later doctors did notice discrepancies between what Galen described and what they observed, they often assumed they must be mistaken, not him. It took until the Renaissance, more than 1,300 years after Galen's death, for physicians like Vesalius to publicly point out his errors and begin correcting human anatomy based on actual human dissection. This is one of history's great ironies. The Romans, so practical in their military medicine, so innovative in their field hospitals and surgical techniques, became trapped by the authority of one brilliant man who worked within the limitations of his time. They showed us how much progress could be made through practical experience and careful observation, but they also showed us the danger of treating any human authority as infallible, no matter how knowledgeable or well-intentioned. The Roman contribution to medicine wasn't just in what they discovered or invented. It was in how they organized healing, how they made it systematic and reliable. They proved that medicine could be taught, standardized, and deployed wherever it was needed. They showed that wounded people deserved care, and that providing that care was both possible and worthwhile. They built infrastructure for health in a way no civilization had before. And when Rome eventually fell, when the empire crumbled and much knowledge was lost, it was Roman medical texts, including Galen's extensive writings, that survived in libraries and monasteries, waiting to teach future generations. For better and worse, For what they got right and what they got wrong, the Romans shaped how medicine would develop in the Western world for centuries to come. Looking back across thousands of years, it's easy to judge the ancient healers harshly. They believed in demons and humors. They performed surgeries without understanding infection. They used treatments that sometimes killed rather than cured. They were wrong about so much. But here's what we need to remember. They were also right about so much more than we might expect. They were right that observation matters, that patterns exist in how the body responds to illness and injury. They were right that some plants heal, that cleanliness helps wounds recover, that rest and proper nutrition support the body's own ability to mend itself. They were right that physicians need ethical guidelines, that healers should be taught systematically, that medical knowledge should be written down and shared across generations. Every breakthrough we celebrate in modern medicine rests on foundations laid by people who never saw a microscope, never heard of antibiotics, never imagined the technologies we take for granted today. When a surgeon makes a precise incision, they're using techniques refined over millennia, starting with those Mesopotamian doctors and their bronze needles. When we take aspirin for pain, we're benefiting from observations made by Egyptian physicians who noticed willow bark had healing properties. When doctors swear to do no harm, they're echoing a promise first made on a Greek island 2,500 years ago. The courage it took to be a healer in antiquity is hard to comprehend. Imagine facing diseases you couldn't explain, armed with tools that seem primitive, watching patients suffer and die despite your best efforts. Yet these ancient physicians kept trying. They experimented with new herbs, new techniques, new theories. They accepted that failure was part of learning. They understood that sometimes you had to take risks to discover what worked. Think about that first surgeon who decided to remove a cataract from someone's eye using a bronze needle. How terrifying that must have been for both doctor and patient. Or the Egyptian physician who first tried moldy bread on an infected wound, with no idea why it might help but willing to attempt something unconventional. Or Hippocrates standing before his peers and insisting that natural causes, not divine punishment, explained illness, knowing he was challenging beliefs held sacred for generations. These weren't just medical advances. They were acts of courage, of curiosity, of compassion. They represented humanity's refusal to accept suffering passively, our determination to understand the world around us and within us, our conviction that healing is possible if we just keep searching for answers. And yes, they made mistakes, sometimes terrible ones. Bloodletting killed countless people across centuries. Demons and evil spirits didn't cause disease. The four humors don't exist. But even the mistakes taught us something valuable. That we must always be willing to question, to test, to admit when we're wrong, and try something different. That authority and tradition aren't the same as truth. That yesterday's certainty might be today's error, and today's breakthrough might need tomorrow's correction. When you hold an ancient surgical knife in your hands, perhaps one preserved in a museum, you're touching a direct link to these pioneers. Someone made that tool with care. Someone learned to use it skillfully. Someone trusted their life to the person who wielded it. Behind that simple metal instrument lies an entire world of human struggle, hope, innovation, and dedication. So here's something worth pondering. If you had lived in antiquity and fallen ill, which civilization's healers would you have trusted? Would you have chosen the Egyptians, with their deep understanding of anatomy and their blend of practical remedies and mystical protection? Would you have preferred the Greeks with their rational approach and ethical foundation, even knowing some of their theories were flawed? Or would the Romans have been your choice with their organized efficiency, their battlefield-tested experience, and their commitment to taking care of those who served? There's no wrong answer, really. Each civilization brought something unique to the art of healing. Each had successes and failures. Each contributed pieces to the vast puzzle of medical knowledge that we're still assembling today. We'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts on this. Which ancient healers would you have trusted and why? What surprises you most about medicine in antiquity? Share your reflections in the comments below. These conversations help us all appreciate the remarkable journey that medicine has traveled. And if you've found this exploration of ancient healing fascinating, if it sparked your curiosity about how our ancestors lived, struggled, and innovated, then consider joining us for more stories from the ancient world. Like this video, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires. This is where history's greatest stories come alive, where we explore the human experiences that shaped our world, where we remember that the past isn't just dates and facts, but real people facing real challenges with courage and creativity. The ancient healers couldn't cure everything. They couldn't explain everything, but they tried, and their trying changed the world. That's a legacy worth honoring, worth learning from, and worth passing on to future generations who will continue building on what we know today, correcting our errors, and advancing toward truths we can't yet imagine.